The topic of culturally diverse audiences and getting information out to them is something I'm really passionate about, and something that we're starting to see AI as a tool that people can use, not to like, it's not going to do anything by itself at this point, but something that can enable people to improve the quality of information is actually really powerful. So when we work with the NHS, we're really interested in self-care and how people can look after their own health. So yeah, we started developing a couple of solutions based on what we'd learned and seen from working with the NHS and the government, local governments, resulting in our Damibu Feeds platform. Damibu Feeds is a content management system that enables people to leverage all of that AI insight to produce content for different audiences.
So welcome to this week's episode of Akoni Tech Talks. We are joined by John today. It's a pleasure to have you here, John.
Thank you very much.
And before we get stuck into today's main topics, tell us a little bit about where your interest in tech sort of first started and talk us through right up to your current role with Damibu.
Oh, how far back do you want to go? No, yeah, I mean, I've always been a nerdier kid. Obviously, when we were at school, like computers were something that was quite hard to get your hands on. There was only one room, but I've always been super excited about it. But then as I went through education and stuff, I did study computing, but when I came into the world of work, I actually didn't end up with a career in IT. I just couldn't get anything. So for about 10 years, I was just doing lots of little odd jobs and bits and bobs, and lived abroad for a while. And when I came back, I got this great job working with a behavior change company. So at that point in my life, I was quite familiar with human-centered design. I was quite interested in it, reading up a lot about it, and I had this opportunity to work with a company that was doing that side of things. Did that for quite a few years until I got an opportunity. I met Dave from Damibu, who's the CEO, and he liked what we were doing. And because Damibu's background, or Dave's background, was in gaming, he was very interested in the company taking on a lot what the gaming industry was doing, and they didn't call it human-centered design, they just called it making good games. So he said, do you want to come on board at Damibu with all that human-centered design knowledge, some of that archaic computing knowledge that hasn't been used in quite a while, and put it to work with, you know, making public sector solutions? And I was like, that actually sounds great. Yeah, so that was about 9 years ago now. I've been there for 9 years.
Amazing. And we'll come on to Damibu, but let's start with AI and the role it plays in supporting government bodies, making their messaging more accessible and relatable to culturally diverse audiences. Can you share some examples of this sort of process and how this is implemented in action?
Yeah, I can share my perspective on it. I think it's a tricky one because it's something that's in movement. I work very closely with a few local authorities where we're living, and I know that there's a lot happening behind the scenes in terms of how government is preparing for the use of AI, both in terms of like practical tools, but also the policies that are going to surround them. I think everyone knows by this point the cat's out the bag. You know, there's no going back. Obviously, there's the immediate practical benefits that it brings to anybody who's got an office job. The ability to type something in and get a quick answer, and it's normally pretty right most of the time. But yeah, the topic of culturally diverse audiences and getting information out to them is something I'm really passionate about, and something that we're starting to see AI as a tool that people can use, not to like, it's not going to do anything by itself at this point, but something that can enable people to improve the quality of information is actually really powerful. It's that creative element. So I've been doing a lot of work recently with Eastern European communities, and even if you go to members of that community and say to them, you know, how can we improve public sector information? That's quite a big question. It's
Yeah.
it's a bit of a burden that we're putting on them to say, okay, can you figure it out?
Hmm.
The best part of using AI for something like that is that it can handle all of that complexity
Yeah.
and boil it down to a couple of useful sentences. And that for me, specifically around making messages more relatable for different cultures, is the power where we can now go to those communities and say, we're not going to ask you these big lofty questions that are difficult to answer. Here's a list of suggestions, and you tell us which ones you like and which ones you don't.
Yeah.
And suddenly that's something that's not only achievable, it's quite quick, efficient, and exciting for those involved.
Mm. And when it comes to Damibu, Damibu's been at the forefront of digital solutions for over a decade, but can you tell us a bit more about the sort of flagship product, the Damibu Feeds, and how it specifically helps organizations to create more inclusive digital content?
Yeah, sure. So, for a long time, Damibu was what you'd call like a digital agency. We were going in and people would say, "Oh, we need this thing building," and we'd bring some of our kind of knowledge to the table. Um, but essentially, we were building the products that people wanted us to build. But we learnt a lot along the way, and because we were working a lot with public sector, we got a bit of a reputation for delivering good products to public sector, specifically the NHS. We started to see these trends, essentially the problem over here is very similar to the problem over there, and that's interesting. And so we started thinking about how we can address the underlying challenges that are being faced. We've always been very interested in that public messaging aspect and how to make it so that people can essentially help themselves rather than having to rely on these systems that exist. So when we work with the NHS, we're really interested in self-care and how people can look after their own health. Um, so yeah, we started developing a couple of solutions based on what we'd learned and seen from working with the NHS and the government, local governments, resulting in our Damibu Feeds platform. Um, Damibu Feeds is a content management system that enables people to leverage all of that AI insight to produce content for different audiences. So exactly what we've been talking about. We're really excited in keeping it agnostic. You know, a lot of people say, "Oh, is it an app? Is it this?" And we're like, actually, we care about the information. So if you want to print that out and put it up on a wall, that's absolutely fine. The challenge we're really excited about is how that information comes to be. And if you look at traditional mechanisms, so I remember speaking to an NHS trust up north, and they were doing this already, but it was by hand, and it was a massive laborious process. And the most interesting thing about that is they were so good at it was becoming more and more popular across the trust, and other trusts were looking to them going, "Oh my gosh, you can provide all this amazing information for all these different communities. Can you do that for us too?" And at a certain point they have to say, "Well, no," because the turnaround for one document was 1 month, 2 months,
Yeah.
involving 10, 20 people.
Hmm.
And so when we think back to that previous question, oops, when we think back to that previous question of um how can AI help? Well, it's that laboriousness
Yeah.
of reducing that workload down to something that can be essentially automated with human overview.
Absolutely. And why is it critical for government bodies and large organizations to ensure that their digital content is not only accessible, but also linguistically and culturally relevant to diverse communities?
That's a good question. So I have a bit of a soapbox that I stand on when someone uses the word accessible. I'm really passionate. At Damibu, one of our earliest projects when I joined the team was working with a local museum for the My House of Memories project, which was for people living with dementia.
Mhm.
And this was one of the reasons I was drawn to work at Damibu because at that time, people living with dementia, normally older adults, were just seen as non-digital users. And Dave, our CEO, was really passionate about this idea that actually no one's just tried to make something for that type of user before. And House of Memories is just doing really well even today, getting bigger and better. And it's really proved the point that actually, if you build something for a specific type of user, anybody can become a digitally native or whatever. Um, yeah, so that kind of idea that you can build a tool that's exactly right for the person. Um, I see that a lot applied to the word accessible, essentially, that
Yeah.
we think of accessibility and we think of disabilities, and obviously that's super important. But actually, it's much more than that. And when we think of public sector and the NHS, often, how many times are you getting sent documents in a PDF format? PDF's wonderful. I love it, but
Mhm.
it looks awful on a phone. And the experience of trying
Yeah.
to read an A4 document on a phone
Mhm.
is inconvenient at the best of times. And you have to start asking the question, how many people are not bothering or they're
Yeah.
skim reading and missing important details because it's not a great experience. So for me, accessibility has to take in not just obviously all of the WCAG standards for making something that's capable for everyone to use,
Yeah.
but also something that's convenient for everyone to
Mhm.
use.
Definitely.
One thing we're seeing a lot recently is obviously on the topic of language.
Yeah.
And again, I hate to mention AI in every response, but the ability to auto translate is just getting better and better
Yeah.
by the day. But now what we're seeing is devices like iPhones and Android phones that can do that conversion on the fly.
Mhm.
And if somebody's got their device set up, so if you are hard of vision or you need a screen reader, chances are your phone is already set up exactly just how you like it.
Mhm.
So for me, accessibility is about playing to those existing tools.
Yeah.
Apple and Google are smashing it these days when it comes
Mhm.
to accessibility. What we now need to focus on is how do we make the language convenient?
Yeah.
Not just there, but something that people understand. I was chatting to a colleague who's been doing some work for us over in Manchester yesterday with some Ukrainian refugees, and part of that was about us trying to insert some knowledge of Ukrainian culture into the information.
Mhm.
So there's this idea that um, yes, the information, let's assume it's not in a PDF and it's there on the phone and it's working with the screen reader, but the information itself may be written for a Western audience. And there may be some assumptions within it that the reader is a British person who's familiar with the healthcare system.
Yeah.
And so some of the differences between the Ukrainian healthcare system and the British healthcare system um, can make that document quite confusing to understand.
Yeah.
And so we were really excited about so the question is, how do we make it more accessible for that group?
Yeah.
It sounds like it's really difficult challenge, but 90% of it can be solved by a sentence at the top of the document that says, here's how the British healthcare system is different to the Ukrainian healthcare system. Here are some of the assumptions that a British person might have already just from growing up around the NHS. And then all of a sudden you unlock the rest of the info because the NHS is producing amazing information. You just need those prerequisites.
Mhm.
So for me, that's the next big challenge in accessibility.
Yeah.
The tools for making things, read aloud or zoom in are all getting better, but they're already amazing. Now we need to focus on how do we improve the quality of the information as well.
Yeah. And so we've just touched on, the importance of assisting that bridge of communication gaps between various communities and why it's so critical, especially in
Mm.
healthcare and the NHS. But the public sector often faces barriers like budget constraints and legacy systems and resistance to change. But what do you see as the biggest challenge to digital innovation within this space?
Great question. Um, it's always changing, so I always have to stop and think.
Mm,
What's really interesting right now in the public sector is there's a clear appetite to get on board, and everyone's clear that AI is opening up new opportunities around innovation.
yeah.
Understandably, public sector has to be cautious in jumping into this, and it feels like things are moving quicker than ever. I think that what we're already seeing is stuff like, Microsoft Office Copilot, and my Gmail got a button the other day where, it'll just summarize an email for you, and those quick wins will come into play. I think the next stage is really about dare I say, applying some of those human-centered design principles and taking a step back. At a certain point, we need to look at the way these systems currently work, and rather than thinking, okay, how do we crowbar in some AI and other buzzwords, and take a step back and say, okay, well, if we had the opportunity to redesign the system with this information, with these abilities that we have now, what would that look like? And I think you hit the nail on the head there, that it's budget that's the challenge, because that's an expensive process. And um, but the risk is that we start investing into an archaic system that doesn't quite work. So I mentioned the trust earlier that was doing everything by hand. Um, and that relied a lot on face-to-face meetings. So literally getting 10, 20 people in the room. So when we're talking about budget, some of those people are high level clinicians, consultants. Just getting an hour of their time is expensive, and it's happening regularly. We started floating this idea of, well, what's the power of having them in the room? And it's that quorum. And maybe we could do something that we're calling like a digital quorum, where you can send out a message, an email or whatever to 5 or 6 people and say, well, okay, what's the quorum we need to get, if 4 people agree on this, it's done. And so we don't have to send it to 30 people. We can just send it to 10, stagger it, see who responds, and completely redesign the process with the goal of reducing the amount of time required for these time valuable
Mhm.
professionals.
Yeah.
Um, so that was quite exciting to us. The idea that when you start to step back and you can apply these new technologies, what's the actual practical implementation
Mhm.
advantages? How does it affect people's day-to-day work?
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's where we can start to justify some of the costs involved then, that it's not about replacing someone. It's about helping someone take a 1 hour task to make it only take 5 minutes.
Hmm.
Actually, I did something myself yesterday. So we, from a project management sense here at Damibu, we've got Jira, which is like our task manager for the developers, and Story Tracker. We use Clockify for just basic time tracking because everyone works remotely. Um, and we do digital stand-ups on Slack as well, because I don't like the whole, face-to-face stand-ups with everyone. We just fill it out and chat as needed. And there's a couple of other, like, SaaS systems that we use. And it was that realization that I'm spending about an hour every day just logging onto each of these, downloading a report and looking at it. And within about an hour, I was able to just get a script to feed all this into an AI. So now I just get a morning email and it says, I've reviewed everything. You really need to pay attention to this right now.
Wow.
Otherwise, it looks like everyone's doing quite well. It was quite funny actually, because it came back and said, it looks like John spent about 2 hours setting his camera up for a podcast yesterday. That seems excessive. I was like, oh right, okay. All right. I guess I'm not I'm subject to this rule as well.
No,
Does
I
that answer
think
your question? Sorry.
yes, no, I think also that's a nice sort of segue into, you know, I think you kind of answered the question there about how, how does tools like Safe AI and things like Damibu Feeds evolve to better serve the government and public organizations? Well, like you say, it's the resource side of things as well, because it's expensive to have those people's
Hmm.
time. That's a way you can kind of counteract that sort of budget issue. But are there any other ways that you think Safe AI and things like Damibu Feeds can evolve to better serve the government and public
Hmm.
organizations in the future?
Yeah, safe AI is a term that we've been throwing around a bit, and I'm aware it's not been fully defined, but it's because we're quite passionate on because our company is all about producing the highest quality information, but we're quite passionate on the idea that we don't just generate stuff and throw it out into the public. We know there's these huge problems now with, search engines are just becoming overloaded with generative content, making it even more difficult to find trusted sources. So, one of the key things of what we're trying to achieve is to have really quick and convenient validation processes from real people with I don't want to say real qualifications because sometimes life experience is enough. We've been when I was speaking to the Ukrainian group, um the person who led the session from the Ukrainian group, I was saying that they're already qualified for validating the accuracy of what it's like to live in the Ukraine.
Yeah.
So they don't need to have a diploma or anything like that, but we do need somebody because we do everything we can to reduce these AI hallucinations, but it happens. It happens with a frequency, and maybe the tools will get to a point where that's not an issue, but we're still a long way off. So yeah, that's what we're really excited about is this space of, well, okay, how do we tackle all of that by creating essentially a technology so that humans can more closely manage stuff? And even that is AI assisted.
Yeah.
So whilst we have this platform that allows people to go in and say, okay, I've read this and I approve of it, or actually I need to add a comment, that's not quite right, and I wouldn't say that. We're still using AI to every piece of content goes through a risk assessment type thing so that we can say, okay, this is a high priority. It really needs some looking at. We find that particularly useful with the translation as well. So we are leveraging AI for the translation capabilities, but we also have this team of professional translators who live all around the world. And if something is flagged as high priority, or like, okay, we need a translator who has, a specific clinical qualification because this one it does mention some medicines or something like that.
Mhm.
So yeah, we're very excited about these tools that can surround the use of AI to alleviate some of those concerns because everyone knows, anyone who spent 2 minutes chatting to one of these bots knows that, it can go wrong very quickly and in profound ways. Um, but that's not to say it's not solvable. Ironically, it just needs that human element brought back into it.
Yeah.
Um, whilst recognizing that the goal here is to save time, to save money,
Hmm.
not drop the quality. So there's definitely a middle ground to be found. I'm not
Hmm.
saying that we found it. It's
Yeah.
still an exploration. And what we found is every organization's different.
Hmm.
We learned that a long time ago when we were developing. So we developed Damibu Feeds. We started in 2018. We had to kind of hastily launch it in 2020, March 2020, because we just got an email that at that time we were focusing a lot on how GP practices in primary care communicate with their local
Yeah.
population. It's closed today because we're doing training or something like that. And that came about because we were working very closely with our local NHS and realized that because of the nature of how the NHS is structured, some GP practices, they're mostly small businesses, and some of them might
Yeah.
just be a 1 or 2 man band, and neither of them are website people, so they're
Yeah.
not updating the website. And then it's like, oh, why is our phone slammed at 8 o'clock? It's like, well, you don't have a web solution, and people aren't being informed. And we were banging this drum back in 2018, and then when 2020 hit, the realization that actually every primary care organization needs to be able to be getting updates out to the population like by the hour at one point
Hmm.
during the
Hmm.
pandemic. Um, so we were always very excited about how to get this into different organizations, but we very
Yeah.
quickly learned that every organization wanted to use it slightly differently. So
Yeah.
some of them would be, oh, I want it fully automated. I want nothing to
Yeah.
do with it. If you can just keep my information up to date without me doing lifting a finger, that's great. And we were very excited about that because we could.
Yeah.
But equally, we were getting some who was actually, I have a network of 35 GP practices, general practices. Um, we have someone who can review, and it's really important for our brand that we get someone to sign off every individual thing.
Yeah.
And for me, the most exciting part was the ones who started off with, no, I want to check everything by hand. Like it's very important to me. And then after 2 months, they were like, actually, this is really good. Can we just automate this now? I'm kind
Yeah.
of, yeah, great. But I can't think of any two organizations that are using Damibu Feeds that use
Hmm.
it in the same way.
Yeah.
And I don't, I think that's actually more a signature of public sector organizations than use. I feel like private sector are more like, oh, there's this new SaaS platform, we'll adapt to it. Whereas public sector, there's a lot more um, kind of concrete processes that have to be
Yeah.
adhered to. There's no scope for adapting, so the tool has to adapt to the
Hmm.
process instead.
Yeah. And what do you think will be the next major breakthrough in making government communications even more inclusive and accessible to diverse audiences?
Was that this is where I say us, right?
Yeah.
um, that's a great question. I think I'm almost reluctant to say it because the idea of public sector organizations working in silos is, people have been saying that for 10, 20 years, or maybe since the dawn of time. I've only worked in the area for 10 or 20 years. Um, I would hope that's the next big breakthrough of being able to, and what we see now more and more is, especially since the introduction of ICBs, the local, sorry, the NHS recently introduced something called integrated care boards, which is like a bigger footprint for people to work together.
Yeah.
So I'm based up in Liverpool, and whilst Liverpool was very good at working with its neighbours, now it's like forced that it's all of Greater Merseyside and Cheshire. Um, I think that momentum is going to keep going, but also we'll get to a point where with the use of technology, it won't be neighbors communicating. It'll be something picking up. Oh, look, this area down in southwest England is doing something similar or has a similar challenge to what's happening in northeast England, but one of them has almost solved the issue. Let's not reinvent the wheel up here and use the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually, it's coming right now. I'm seeing that more and more with emails coming my way of, oh, look, we've just found this thing down here. And
Yeah.
it's funny actually because people contact us thinking we're going to be angry when there's a solution that's somewhat similar, but where we see it as this huge opportunity to collaborate. We're like, oh, great. Well, they can take our
Yeah.
cultural stuff and put it into their solution. So I often get these emails of, uh-oh, like these guys are doing something similar to you. And I'm like, can you do me an introduction, please? That's
Yeah.
amazing. But I think it's really good for me to see that that's happening, that it's no longer um, local areas communicating. It's across the whole country, Scotland and Wales as well. Like if something good's happening and the technology is making it completely distributed, there's no need, there's no like shared servers or need for resources to actually be close to each other. It can be as distant as it needs to be, potentially even across different countries.
Yeah. That segues us nicely actually onto the trending in tech round. So, in recent news, Francophone scholars are sounding the alarm about the dominance of English in artificial intelligence development, warning about the potential risks to global cultural diversity and national sovereignty. In an open letter published by the Future of Life Institute, experts said there's a lack of linguistic and cultural diversity in AI models and safety assessments. And we've kind of touched a bit on that
Hmm.
today. But the experts are calling on global leaders and tech giants to prioritize multilingualism in AI development, viewing it not as an afterthought, but a fundamental aspect of creating safe, equitable, and truly global AI. Now, how do you see the dominance of English in AI development posing risks to global cultural diversity? And what steps do you think global leaders and tech giants should take to kind of prioritize that multilingualism in AI so it ensures a more inclusive outcome?
Yeah, I mean, so I can't claim to be like an expert in AI. As I say, my background's a bit mixed, but we definitely in the work that we do, we've seen that. So we play with a lot of different models. We've spoken to companies locally who are building custom models, which is really cool. But it doesn't change the fact that a lot of this underlying learning is based on English. And so when we're trying to draw out some cultural insights, we find that some countries it's just very bad quality in terms of what the AI is spitting out because it doesn't have that learning underneath. So it's definitely a thing. We've definitely seen it. It's frustrating for us because what we want to do as a company is support these communities, and the tools aren't well rounded enough in those areas. But that's all about to change. You know, some of these. I think yesterday, something came out of China, a new model that looks to be blowing some of the OpenAI stuff or equaling some of the OpenAI stuff. And I think rather than needing to clamp down with rules and enforcement, market forces are going to sort this out. Where, yes, lots of people speak English, but if there are good models available that are better for different language native tongues, we're going to see a lot of people around the world switching to those instead. And yeah, so I think the battle has just started. I think, yeah, some of these Chinese models and some of the stuff coming out of Asia are already really good. Um, and whether it's just, I don't think these companies are going to be satisfied with saying, okay, we'll share the audience. Yeah, traditionally, that's not been the response. So, and I think that's a good thing. I think if all of these companies can be saying, actually, we want to get as um, as much inclusive learning in different languages as possible. It's just a little trickier now that we're far more well versed in what ethical AI training looks like.
Yeah.
And perhaps some of these companies got a leg up by not worrying about that in the first place. Whereas now there's a real emphasis on, well, if you're going to do that, let's do it right. So it might be a little slower than the growth we initially saw, where it was almost explosive, right? It felt like overnight everything was just here. But yeah, I think market forces are going to balance it out, and and personally, I'm really excited because I think it's going to be hugely powerful. And for us, we're already comparing all of these different models to say, okay, in terms of these challenging cultural questions that you only get from having quite a large knowledge base, what's coming out best?
Yeah.
That's a bit of a non-answer, I'm aware, but
No,
it's an
I
exciting time.
Yeah, absolutely. And we come on to the final section of the podcast, which is the this or that quick fire round. So, John, if you had to pick iPhone or Samsung,
Samsung. Yeah,
and
I actually like a
Spotify,
Pixel, but Samsung.
and Spotify or Apple,
Spotify.
and Netflix or going to the cinema.
Oh, Netflix. I've never enjoyed the cinema. Yeah, I don't like other people eating popcorn. You just sit at home, nice TV, watch some Netflix.
And laptops or tablets,
Laptops. I'm a keyboard enthusiast, so
and ChatGPT or virtual reality.
oh. Okay, so work, ChatGPT, for play, virtual reality.
And video calls or voice notes.
Video calls for sure. Yeah, yeah. Never got to
Yeah.
grips with voice notes.
And finally, if you could bring back one piece of tech that's either now evolved in its format or it no longer exists, what would it be and why?
Do you know, I'm tempted to say just those old phones where you'd get like 7 days battery life and all it did was do a phone call. But yeah, the number of times I've been caught out without a charger, and if I just had an old phone in my bag that I didn't have to worry about, that'd be amazing. So yeah, Nokia brick phones that last for a week. That's what I want.
Nice. Oh, John, it's been so enjoyable chatting with you today.
Oh,
Thank you
thank you very
so much
much.
for your time. That brings us to the end of this week's episode.
No. It's been great. Thank you for joining. Yeah, it's great.